His followers, in fact, his brother was one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. Believed his own brother. Not just those people, of course, but there were early witnesses outside of the New Testament corpus, or who we call the church fathers. Polycarp, for example, in the 1st and 2nd century, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr. These are the early leaders in the churches in the 1st and 2nd century. Their teaching is summarized in the Apostles' Creed. All of them wrote about the unique sonship and divinity of Jesus Christ. So you may have read the Da Vinci Code and thought you're reading the Bible, you're not. Or Tom Harper's Pagan Christ. Those are not historical texts. They're basically nonsense. What the early church believed is a matter of historical record about the person of Jesus Christ. They didn't invent his divinity 4 centuries later and then go and burn the rest of the evidence. These are stories made up for the movies. They are not history. There are not just friendly witnesses, because you might say, well, John, that was their impression of Jesus, but let's face it, they were Christians, so they were going to say that, weren't they? Was there anybody else who actually believed that this guy was crucified, and any recollection of him working miracles, and certainly this came about being raised from the dead, and so forth? Well, interestingly enough, yes. There was a pagan historian, Thales, in AD 55, in the 3rd volume of his Histories, who talks about a darkness coming over the land that coincided with the crucifixion of Jesus. If you read the New Testament, you'll discover that at the death of Christ, a darkness, it was said, came over the land. Thales describes it as an eclipse of the sun. Cornelius Tacitus, the great Roman historian, AD 56 to 120 are his dates, in his famous Annals, which is laced with anti-Christian venom, has a very famous paragraph about the procurator Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion of Jesus and the superstition, inverted commas, of his resurrection from the dead. Suetonius, another Roman historian and a court official under Hadrian, in his work The Life of Claudius, writes, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he, that's Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Luke, the Apostle Luke, actually records this incident in Acts 18:2. In his Lives of Caesar, Suetonius also comments on the infamous reign of Nero and records the punishment inflicted on the Christians. Quote, a punishment by Nero was inflicted on Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Pliny the Younger, another pagan source, a contemporary of Tacitus, was a Roman administrator. And he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan in AD 110 to ask about this new sect called Christians and whether he should just continue executing them. He wasn't sure. He was just sort of lopping their heads off and thinking, should I keep doing this or what? Just give me a bit of advice. Not sure about what they believe. And so the emperor he actually wrote to the Emperor Trajan and said this about the Christians. As far as he could tell from his investigations, the sum total of their guilt or error was no more than the following. They had met regularly before dawn on a determined day and sung antiphonally, that's alternately by 2 groups, a hymn to Christ as to a God. They also took an oath not for any crime, but to keep from theft, robbery, and adultery, not to break any promise. So we have these various accounts. There's more. Lucian, in his a Greek satirist, in his work, The Death of Peregrinus. We have a work by a theologian and Christian apologist called Origen, who refers to a book by a pagan critic called Celsus. And the fact that Jesus had a questionable birth story was well known. Who was Jesus' mother? Who was Jesus' father? And what was done in this particular account, Celsus had written off the birth of Jesus as an affair between Mary and a Roman soldier, and he also described Jesus' miracles as Egyptian sorcery. Now, these hostile witnesses are important. There's more. There's Flavius Josephus. There is the Jewish Talmud from the 1st and 2nd century, who record numerous important things about Christians. The Talmud records, for example, about the trial of James, the brother of Jesus. It's important that these hostile witnesses note these things, because the fact that Jesus was a miracle worker or a wonder worker is evident from the fact that they tried to explain his miracles away in terms of sorcery, because they didn't believe. In fact, this is what you can learn from all the external sources about Christ. If you didn't have the Bible, his name, Jesus or Christ, the time and place of his public ministry during the reign of Pontius Pilate, his mother's name, the ambiguous nature of his birth, the name of one of his brothers, his renown as a teacher appealing to the masses of Jews and Greeks, his notoriety as a miracle worker or sorcerer, the type of Messiah being applied to him by his followers, his kingly and divine status to some, the time and manner of his execution, the involvement of Jewish and Roman authorities in his execution, a coincidence of an eclipse at the time of his crucifixion, and the belief in the resurrection among his followers, and the rapid growth of the movement. All of this can be learned through extra-biblical sources about the person of Jesus Christ. A lot of people think, well, there's no evidence for Christ outside of the Bible. But there is. One of the most common objections, though, is that now, my impression of Jesus, some will say, is, okay, maybe he was special. Maybe he did work these miracles. Amazing. I mean, aren't there sort of modern-day healers that do impressive things? Maybe he had some trumped-up ideas about himself, but basically there have been lots of other prophets, lots of other Messiah-type figures, lots of other God-type men. There's other religions. Surely they are superficially different, but fundamentally the same. They all tell you to be nice and good and help old ladies across the road and so on and so forth. Well, actually, when you really compare these claims of these different religious faiths, they are superficially similar, but they are fundamentally, totally different. Let's consider just for a moment some of the other impressions of Jesus in counterclaims. One of the things that's very important to note is that the very idea of revelation from God, that's a God speaking into, revealing himself into history, is totally unique to biblical faith. Now, there have been copies since, and I don't mean this in any rude way if there is any Muslim believers in the audience here, but Islam, some 7 centuries later, claims the authority of the Bible, Old and New Testament, and then modifies its claims about the person of Christ, as does Mormonism later. So you've had copycat-type revelations, which I consider pseudo-Christian heresies, but the basic idea of revelation from God is unique to biblical faith. Why is that? Well, it's very simple. Most of the world's religions don't believe in God. Buddhism has no God. Hinduism has no God. There are 300 million gods that are an expression of Brahman, the one, the impersonal non-being, but there is no infinite personal God who speaks and reveals himself. People often say, well, what about all the other scriptures? The first question is, in comparative religion, well, what scriptures do you mean? Because it was Christian Western thinkers who gave those names to the Bible of other faiths. Because other faiths do not consider, for example, the Vedas, or the Upanishads, or the Analects of these various faiths, revelations from God. They make no such claim. They are the teachings and reflections of thinkers and philosophers about how to be enlightened. It is the Christian faith which posits a personal, eternal, creator God who speaks into history. That's why the Bible is full of prophecy. There are some 109 prophecies, distinct prophecies, just about the Messiah in the Old Testament. There are actually 330, but some of them are repetitious of others. There are 109 distinct ones, written hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born. Things totally outside of his control, where he would be born, for example. You read the book of Daniel, it speaks in great detail about the rise of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire and so forth. Because the God of Christianity, the God and Father of Jesus Christ, is the